A black tech architect walked into the boardroom ready to present the innovation that could change the world, his world. But before he even opened his mouth, a manager sneered, "Security, remove him. This room's for decision makers, not support staff." The silence from the others was deafening. No one stopped it. No one asked his name. No one saw the man. Just his skin. But exactly 7 minutes later, the manager was out, fired on the spot in front of the very team he thought he controlled. And what happened next? It exposed decades of quiet theft, shattered the company's future plans, and sparked a global reckoning that nobody saw coming. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story of racism in the workplace. It's about what happens when the man they tried to erase owns the very blueprint of tomorrow. Before we begin, drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if this story hits you in the chest, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever been underestimated. It was just an ordinary morning, until he stood up. Elijah Cole walked into the marble lobby of Zenith Technologies just after sunrise, the morning light cutting through the glass like judgment. He moved with quiet authority, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are, even in a world designed to forget. His shoes echoed on the polished floor, a sound too sharp for someone not yet invited into the room. He passed a receptionist who didn't lift her head. She reached for the intercom without looking up. "Delivery access is to the rear entrance," she said, her voice clipped. Elijah paused. "I'm not here for delivery," he replied softly. She glanced up then, her mouth faltering for a moment before offering a half-hearted smile, the kind reserved for black men in suits who seem out of place. "Oh, my mistake." He nodded, gracious but firm. "Common one." This was not his first building, not his first name badge, not his first lobby where skin was red before title. Upstairs, the meeting room buzzed with pretense. Caffeine, ambition, and impatience hung in the air like expensive cologne. Brad Whitaker stood at the front with his arms crossed, vice president, mouth full of charm, eyes full of something else. He was a man raised on country clubs and legacies, fluent in boardroom innuendo and polite exclusions. And when Elijah entered the room, Brad's grin tightened just a little. There was no outburst, no slur. Just the subtle recalibration of a room that didn't expect a black man to be part of the decisions, only the data. "Elijah," Brad said, too loudly. "Didn't know the facilities team was sitting in on strategic reviews now." Chuckles rippled across the room. Elijah placed his folder on the table, slow and deliberate. "That's because I'm not. I'm here to present the architecture behind our AI integration plan. The one that cut your costs by 41% last quarter." Silence. Then paper shuffling, throat clearing, a few embarrassed glances. The conversation resumed, but the air had shifted. The rest of the meeting unfolded with forced civility. Elijah spoke calmly, clearly, with the precision of a man who'd had to work twice as hard to be half as accepted. Every word was met not with appreciation, but appraisal. Not with trust, but quiet doubt. He was in the room, yes, but still on trial. Afterward, Brad clapped a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Hell of a mind you've got there, Elijah. Just remember, we've all got to fit the culture upstairs, right?" It was a whisper laced in warning. A smile wrapped around a leash. Elijah nodded, but inside something cooled. Not anger. Not yet. But a kind of knowing that sits deep in your bones, the understanding that no matter how far you climb, they'll always pretend you came in through the service door. He left the room unnoticed, but not unchanged. Outside, the city hummed. The sun had risen higher. But for men like Elijah, the shadow had just begun to stretch. By Wednesday, the Argus files were missing. Elijah noticed it in the small ways first: a mislabeled folder, a version number out of place, a spreadsheet where his name had been stripped from the author metadata. It was the sort of erasure that didn't come with alarms, only silences. And it came wrapped in bureaucratic smiles and hallway nods that never quite reached the eyes. He sat alone at his terminal, his fingers still on the keys, long after the screen had gone dark. Argus had been his life's work for the last 6 months. An adaptive algorithm built to predict consumer behavior through real-time neurofeedback. Elegant, fast, patent-worthy. And now, diluted, renamed, and handed to a boy named Dylan Marks, a 3-year hire fresh from Stanford who called himself a product visionary but couldn't debug a for loop if it bit him in the chest. The meeting where it happened was a casual one, or so the invite had claimed. Alignment session, the subject line had said. Elijah arrived 5 minutes early, like always. But the slideshow was already rolling when he walked in, and Dylan was already mid-sentence. Our new Dynamo system will leverage real-time adaptation for scalable decision matrices. Elijah froze. That was his sentence. His phrasing. His system. He didn't interrupt. Not yet. He sat, eyes locked on the screen, listening as Dylan stammered through graphs Elijah had spent nights perfecting. Graphs he recognized not just in concept, but in design. The colors, the layout, even the mislabeled y-axis he'd meant to fix but forgot. It was all his. The room nodded, took notes, and offered compliments. When Dylan finished, Brad stood to clap. Now that, he said, is what innovation looks like. Elijah waited until the room began to stir. Then he stood, his voice calm like a scalpel. That framework, he said, was developed under my login. On my server. Submitted last quarter under the project title, Argus. If it's now called Dynamo, I'd like to understand why my name isn't on a single slide. The silence was thick. Dylan looked to Brad, who smiled as if nothing had gone wrong. Relax, Cross, he said, laughing. We're all one team here. Dylan's just presenting the group's progress. The group. As if Elijah was an idea and not a person. As if his work was communal property, available for the taking so long as it came from the right hands. No one corrected Brad. No one defended Elijah. They didn't need to. In that room, at that moment, the message was clear. You can build the future, but you don't get to own it. Not if your skin still reminds them of the janitor they ignore in the elevator. Later, in the hallway, HR's Megan Shaw walked up beside him. You okay? She asked, voice soft like pity. He didn't answer. Because okay is not a word you use when watching your name disappear in real time. Okay is a fiction like fairness, like colorblindness, like pretending that merit is what decides the outcome. Elijah walked past her and into the stairwell, where his footsteps echoed against the concrete, sharp and lonely. He had learned this lesson before. In grad school, when his research advisor tried to pass off his simulation model as a department effort. In his first job, when a senior manager rewrote Elijah's code and called it a collaboration, just before receiving a promotion. This wasn't new, but it still hurts like the first time. By the time he reached his desk, the nameplate had been moved slightly askew, like a warning. And in his inbox was a meeting request titled, Informal Performance Alignment Check-in. He didn't flinch. He sat down, opened a new terminal window, and began typing a new framework, one no one else would see. Not yet. Not until it was time. In a world that feeds on silence, Elijah had decided they would not erase him quietly. There was no firestorm. No raised voices. No slamming of doors. That's the trouble with certain kinds of violence. It wears a tailored suit, smiles at the receptionist, and hands you a cup of coffee before pulling the rug out from under your future. Elijah learned that again in the morning he was relocated. It came in the form of an email from facilities, not his direct supervisor, not even someone he'd met. It read, as part of our strategic floor plan optimization initiative, your desk will be relocated to B2 Annex, effective Monday. We appreciate your flexibility as we improve interdepartmental synergy. B2 Annex. That was the basement. Technically not below ground, but might as well have been. It was the home of underfunded projects, forgotten interns, and legacy servers that hadn't seen daylight since the Obama administration. It was not where senior AI architects were stationed. It was not where visionaries went to build the future. But Elijah, apparently, was no longer seen that way. He stood in the corridor just outside his current office, watching as a facilities crew wheeled his things, monitor, whiteboard, a stack of unread journals, into a metal cart. No one made eye contact. No one asked if he needed help. The move had been arranged like a cleanup. Quiet, clinical, complete. Megan from HR passed him in the hallway. "Just a temporary space shuffle," she said, offering that corporate smile, a half apology wrapped in plausible deniability. "We're making room for the new Orion team upstairs. You know how fast things are moving." Elijah nodded, but didn't smile. He knew exactly what was moving. And who? Upstairs, Dylan now had his old spot. Near the windows. Near the sunlight. Near power. That afternoon, Elijah found himself staring at a blank wall in B2. The hum of an old air duct the only sound in the room. The carpet was thinner. The lighting is harsher. Even the Wi-Fi lagged. It wasn't punishment, not officially. It was a demotion without language. A realignment. A reshuffling. And everyone involved would swear, if asked, that it wasn't personal. But Elijah knew better. He always had. Because he'd seen this before, when his mother was asked to train the woman who replaced her at the bank. When his cousin, a high school valedictorian, was told he didn't seem the right fit for any of the internships he applied to, because he didn't match the culture. And that was the phrase, wasn't it? Culture. Not race. Never race. Too vulgar, too obvious. No, now the language has evolved. The blade was cleaner, the cut more precise. Cultural fit, tone, executive presence, these were the new uniforms of the same old game. He opened his laptop, logged in, or tried to. Access denied. Another email had arrived while he was moving. "In light of recent system updates, your credentials have been temporarily suspended pending a review of project access tiers. We apologize for the inconvenience." He sat back, staring at the screen. His files. His code. The architecture he had built line by line, night after night, no longer his. Gone. Rebranded. Dynamo was now in Dylan's hands. Elijah's fingerprints had been wiped clean. He opened an old backup drive, silently grateful for the habit his father taught him. Never leave your work where someone else can claim it. He pulled up the original Argus schema. It was there. Whole. Uncorrupted. Time-stamped. He stared at the lines of code as if they were scripture. In that moment, he wasn't angry. Not in the way the world liked to see black men angry, loud, wild, threatening. No, Elijah's anger was colder. It was the kind that didn't shout. It whispered. "I see you," it said. "And I'm not done." He closed his laptop and looked at the wall again. It was bare. Colorless. But in his mind, he saw something else. Not revenge. Correction. And as he sat there, alone in a room they thought he wouldn't fight from, Elijah began drawing up the new blueprints. Not just for a product. For the reckoning. By the time the applause echoed through the 12th floor, Elijah was already walking past the vending machines near the back stairwell. He had learned long ago that dignity doesn't announce its exit. It moves quietly, with a straight back and a silent bow. Upstairs, Dylan had just finished presenting Elijah's model. Again. But this time, it wasn't just theft. It was baptism. They had rebranded the entire framework, renamed the architecture, softened the language, whitewashed the documentation, and positioned it as the flagship product for a new strategic partnership. Elijah's name was not mentioned. Not once. They called it innovation. Elijah called it erasure. He watched the live stream from a flickering monitor in B2, the one with a cracked bezel and a 2-second delay. Dylan stood at the podium with his tailored suit and hesitant grasp of the algorithm, tripping over terms Elijah had coined. Brad smiled beside him, ever the architect of respectable sabotage. They were building the future, they said. But Elijah had already seen the blueprint. He had drawn it. What hurt most wasn't the theft. It wasn't even the demotion or the locked credentials. It was how everyone around him, people he had eaten lunch with, stayed late for, covered during flu season, had adjusted to his absence without protest. They'd moved on, smiled politely, whispered quietly. They hadn't participated in the wrongdoing, but neither had they interrupted it. That, too, was part of the design. Not outright hatred. Not the violence of dogs and hoses, but something quieter, more durable. The absence of memory. The refusal to name injustice in rooms where it wore a lanyard and a quarterly bonus. In a corner cafe a few blocks from the office, Elijah sat across from Ava Brandt, one of the few senior partners who still responded to his messages. She stirred her tea as if she were folding time itself. "I tried," she said. But Brad's got the board convinced that Dylan brings continuity, familiarity. Elijah didn't ask what she meant. He knew. Dylan was safe. Not because of his brilliance, but because of his packaging. He reflected the image leadership was comfortable with. Elijah did not. Elijah asked questions that scraped beneath the surface. He carried too much history in his voice. Too many truths in his gaze. "Sometimes I wonder," he said softly, "how many bridges they expect us to build while standing in the river, water at our necks." Ava looked away. That week, Elijah received an internal memo outlining Zenith's upcoming Global Partnership Summit. It was filled with buzzwords, diversity forward, inclusive design, shared innovation, but nowhere in the documentation was his name. The Argus model, now known as Dynamo 3, would anchor the keynote. And Dylan would present it to the world. Elijah scrolled through the agenda in silence. Then he read it again. And then he began to write. Not code. Not pitch decks. Not strategy memos. He wrote everything he had seen. The emails. The silent meetings. The relocation. The review of his cultural alignment. The back-channel whispers about pedigree and polish. The way Brad had called him the boy at the end during a board meeting and the way no one said a word. He didn't send it to HR. He sent it to Geneva, to Zurich, to Tokyo, to 3 global investment firms whose money Brad needed, but whose trust Elijah had earned because of the work, because of the code. His message was simple. You asked for transparency. This is what it looks like. Then he waited, not with fear. With patience. Because Elijah Cross had never been angry. He had been patient. And precise. And now, the silence they'd wrapped around him like a cage was beginning to crack. There's a sound that black men know well, though it has no name. It's the sound that comes after a white man repeats your idea louder, and the room finally claps. It is not the applause that wounds you, it's the delay. The recognition that only arrives once your voice has been translated into someone else's echo. That was the sound Elijah heard now, muffled through the walls of conference room A17. He sat alone on the other side of the glass, fingers folded, laptop closed. Dylan was presenting again. The words on the screen were his. The architecture, the logic trees, the risk mitigation models. All his. But Dylan delivered them with the swagger of someone born to be believed. And the audience did believe him. They nodded. They smiled. They clapped. What no one said out loud was the reason. Elijah didn't smile. Not when Dylan stumbled over a key metric. Not when Brad leaned in and cleaned it up for him. Not when the CFO declared the model visionary, while glancing right past Elijah's name on the early design draft still sitting in the project archives. That night, Elijah walked home. He didn't take the train. He didn't order a car. He walked because walking reminded him that the ground was still his, even when the floor in those rooms was not. The city hummed around him with the restless urgency of those who believe the future belongs to them. But Elijah knew better. The future wasn't something you inherited. It was something you built while no one watched. Back in his apartment, surrounded by books and blueprints, Elijah opened a drawer and pulled out a journal he hadn't touched in years. It was filled with notes from his grandfather, an engineer who had been denied credit for a water filtration system used across dozens of municipalities. The patent had someone else's name. But the sketches, the soil tests, the early mock-ups, they all bore the steady pen of a man who knew what it meant to create in the shadows. I wasn't meant to be the face, one line read. But I built the frame. Elijah closed the journal, his hands steady. This wasn't new. It never was. Every generation got its own flavor of the same betrayal, to build something brilliant, only to be told it shines brighter without your name attached. But this time, the thief had left receipts. Digital ones. He began documenting everything. Not out of vengeance. Out of clarity. Emails with timestamps. Internal memos with redacted names. Server logs. Meeting invites that never came. The audio recording of Brad joking, "We need someone more," familiar presenting the deck. The way Dylan's name had been inserted into the metadata of Elijah's original files. What they called meritocracy was just muscle memory. And the company was running on instinct. An instinct that whispered, safe means white. Genius means white. Leadership means white. But the numbers disagreed. The numbers didn't care who smiled in the boardroom. They only followed the code. And the code had Elijah's fingerprints. The following week, a memo was circulated. An invitation-only investor dinner at the Atlas Hotel rooftop. Keynote by Dylan. Backed by Brad. Billed as a celebration of Zenith's cultural forward innovation pipeline. Cultural forward. The irony nearly made Elijah laugh. He RSVP. Not to attend. To observe. The time for explaining was over. Now came the reckoning. Not loud, not angry, but inevitable. Because for all their applause, the one thing they hadn't accounted for was that Elijah had never needed a microphone to speak. He had the data. And the truth was just beginning to upload. There are days when racism does not wear a hood, does not shout, does not bare its teeth. No, some days it smiles. It sits beside you in the meeting, it compliments your tie, it nods at your idea, and then writes someone else's name on the award. That's the kind of day Elijah found himself in. The ballroom at the Atlas Hotel was dressed in gold and clean lines. LED screens pulsed with futuristic slogans, innovation, integrity, inclusion, as executives moved like choreography, each one polished, purposeful, rehearsed. The lights shimmered off their suits like armor. And at the center of it all was Dylan, grinning, holding the microphone like a man certain the future would always sound like his voice. The gala was billed as a celebration of the firm's groundbreaking AI milestone, Dynamo. A product Elijah had sculpted, line by line, in the quiet nights when the building had emptied and his name was still in the source code. Now that code was being broadcast across 30-foot screens while Dylan narrated its journey like a bedtime story he'd lived through. The applause came easily. So did the lies. Brad took the stage next, dripping charm and polished insincerity, praising the collaborative genius of our Next G team and calling Dylan a beacon of the company's bold new vision. Elijah stood at the back of the room in a tailored suit that blended into the shadowed edges. He wasn't looking for a spotlight. He was looking for the truth beneath the lighting. And there it was. A truth older than this room, older than this industry. A truth as American as the soil it was built on. You can do everything right, build the machine, carry the load, teach them how to fly, and still be written out of the picture. Not because they didn't see you, but because they did. Brad's voice floated above the crowd like perfume. Leadership, he said, is about more than intelligence. It's about trust, familiarity. It's about choosing people who reflect the image we want to show the world. The room nodded. And that, Elijah thought, is the whole sentence. The whole strategy. Not merit. No results. Image. An image that excluded him by default. He stepped out onto the terrace, the city stretching below like a sea of stories left untold. The cool air bit at his skin, but it was real, and that was more than he could say for the smiles inside. He remembered his grandfather's voice. They'll sell your brilliance and bury your name beside it. So you better learn to build in silence and prepare in secret. And Elijah had prepared. What Brad didn't know was that the Tokyo firm wasn't fooled by Dylan's slideshow. What Dylan didn't realize was that the Geneva board had already requested a private review from the engineer listed on the earliest Argus prototype. And what none of them understood was that the code, the real code, lived off their grid, encrypted, protected, and registered under a different name entirely. Cross Logic Technologies, LLC. He wasn't going to protest. He was going to pull the floor out from beneath them. But not tonight. No, tonight wasn't the night for war. It was the night for witnessing. The kind of witnessing Black folks have done for generations, silent, steady, unblinking. Watching while history tries to erase them in real time and storing every moment like ammunition. Not for revenge. For reckoning. When Elijah stepped back inside, he didn't take a seat. He stood against the wall, watching Dylan finish the speech Elijah had written. And when the camera panned the crowd and the applause began again, Elijah smiled, not bitter, not sad, but deliberate. Because he knew the difference between being denied credit and holding the copyright. The erasure had been elegant, but his return would be seismic. He didn't start the firestorm. He just stopped putting it out. On Monday morning, Elijah's badge scanned red at the executive elevator. Temporary routing error, the front desk associate murmured, eyes avoiding his. She didn't make a call. She didn't apologize. She just gestured vaguely toward the stairs, down. He walked them, not because he had to, but because he wanted to remember each step. Racism, for all its disguises in this century, still knew how to speak with architecture. Who's upstairs, who's in the basement, who belongs on which floor of the American dream. They had moved his desk again. Basement level. No windows, no access to the top-tier sandbox servers, no room for silence to think, only buzz. Constant, fluorescent, mechanical. It smelled like forgotten ambition. Across the building on the 14th floor, Dylan stood beneath a backlit sign that read Orion Integration, Global Launch Strategy. He was giving interviews to reporters who didn't know the algorithm's name had once been Argus, or that the flowcharts were traced from someone else's blueprint. He smiled for the cameras like he'd grown the code from his own mind, not stolen it from a man too polite to scream. But Elijah wasn't polite anymore. He was patient. That morning, he received a message from Kenji Morimoto, CTO of the Tokyo AI firm they'd been courting. It was simple. Your absence was noted. So was the degradation in clarity. May we speak directly? He responded with 3 words. Private line open. Then he sent a single packet of encrypted data, proof of authorship, architectural overlays, source code timestamps, and one internal memo leaked from Brad's office, the one that called him a strategic optics hire and suggested that public-facing leadership required a more familiar profile. In the old days, they would have called it suitability. Now they call it cultural alignment. The name always changed. The intent never did. That same afternoon, the SEC received an anonymous tip, complete with internal logs and performance review manipulations tied to suppressed patent applications. The sender's name wasn't included, but the metadata sang Elijah's signature. He didn't threaten. He illuminated. That's what happens when you try to erase a man who already memorized the blueprint. At 3 p.m., Brad called an emergency sync. Just optics, he said, need to address some noise online. Elijah was invited, finally. But when he entered the glass conference room, he found himself standing not at the table, but behind it. Every chair was filled, every eye already turned toward him, some with anticipation, others with dread. Elijah, Brad began, his voice smooth like bourbon and full of barbed courtesy. We've been seeing some confusion regarding attribution. I just wanted you to clarify, on record, that you're aligned with the next G leadership structure. Elijah didn't sit. He didn't blink. I'm aligned, he said. But not with a structure that deletes the architect to make room for the decorator. There was a pause. Megan from HR sat forward. Can you elaborate? He could. And he did. He listed every instance of theft, Every system-level denial, every gatekeeping tactic draped in bureaucracy. He named no one, but described everything, and when he finished, he produced a flash drive, set it on the table like a gavel, and walked out. The room didn't stop him. They knew better. That night, a single tweet from a tech journalist in Tokyo sent shockwaves. Why is the man behind the Orion AI framework not listed in Zenith's leadership portfolio? Our sources say his name is Elijah Cross. So, why has it been erased? The story went viral not because it was scandalous, but because it was familiar. Everyone knew this story. They'd just never seen it documented so thoroughly. By Friday, Elijah's quiet war had become public theater. Press inquiries. Shareholder anxiety. Internal investigations announced with nervous optimism. Brad tried to spin. Dylan tried to vanish. Elijah didn't have to try. He already knew how this game ended. Because what they all forgot, what America always forgets, is that the people you try to bury remember how to grow in the dark. The morning it all came to light, the air inside Zenith's lobby tasted like panic and cologne. The kind of cold you don't feel in your bones, but in your name, when people suddenly remember it after months of pretending they didn't. Elijah Cross entered the atrium not through the loading dock they'd reassigned him to, not through the service corridor or the side badge scan, but through the front. He walked like a man who belonged to the ground beneath his feet. And in a way he did. The lobby receptionist looked up, startled. He didn't smile at her. He didn't need to. She stood up slowly, as if the weight of history had finally reached her desk. Upstairs, in the 22nd floor boardroom, Brad Whitaker sipped his coffee with the calm of a man who thought the clock still ticked in his favor. He was smiling until the call from Zurich came through. Polaris Capital, Masaka Group, and Horizon Equity, three partners that collectively held the heart of Zenith's next fiscal quarter, had just frozen their investments. Not due to market volatility, not due to product risk, but due to ethical uncertainty and executive oversight. The silence in that boardroom wasn't just awkward. It was terminal. At 11:03 a.m., a document titled Ownership Transition, Cross Holdings LLC was entered into the corporate archive. It listed controlling interests, stake realignment, and the formal removal of Brad Whitaker pending investigation. The memo was signed by a joint committee, international, diverse, meticulous, and Elijah's signature stood at the bottom like a quiet rebellion finally made legal. He didn't shout. He didn't boast. He simply walked into the very room that once laughed at his presence and took the seat at the head of the table. Not because it had been offered. Because he had earned it every inch of the way, and now it belonged to him. But power, for Black folks in America, has never been just a seat. It's a question. What do you do with the truth when they finally let you say it aloud? Elijah addressed the company later that day, not with vengeance, not with gloating, but with something more dangerous: clarity. He spoke about the quiet kind of racism, the hand that never strikes but always denies, the compliment that's actually a cage, the cultural fit that means don't be too much of who you are. He didn't ask them to feel bad. He asked them to remember. Remember the intern who never made it past the second interview because his name sounded like Newark. Remember the woman who designed the framework, but was told she was too assertive for a lead role. Remember every whisper in every corridor that said talent was universal, but leadership still had a look. They listened. Because now they had to. The next morning, headlines blazed across Bloomberg, Forbes, and TechCrunch. The architect they tried to erase now owns the floor. Zenith's revolution begins with the man they called a token. Cross-logic, how one engineer redefined the rules. But to Elijah, the real story wasn't what the press was writing. It was what was happening in the basement, where new hires, young, Black, Latino, immigrant, walked in with resumes that didn't have Ivy League polish, but had fire. And this time, nobody told them to use the side door. Elijah personally interviewed the first three of them. He listened to their ideas, their doubts, their hunger. He nodded, and he said, "Let's build something better." To those over 65, who remember the marches, the dogs, the fire hoses, this was a different kind of fight. Not with batons or cameras, but with code, with boardroom silence, with the war for visibility in a world that still doesn't know how to see. Elijah didn't win because they gave up. He won because he never stopped watching. And in the quiet, behind every insult dressed as policy, he'd kept the receipts. This wasn't just his victory. It was a reminder that the fight never ends when they close the door. It begins when you walk back in.